Now we continue our journey down into the stomach. The stomach is a muscular sac. It's located in the upper left quadrant, and it's immediately inferior to the diaphragm. It's actually quite small. Its internal volume is about 50 milliliters when empty. Now, a soda can is about 350 milliliters. So the space in your stomach when it's empty is about 1/7 the volume of a soda can. That's pretty small. It can expand a lot, up to 4 liters when the stomach is extremely full. And it can extend nearly as far down as the pelvis. But usually it's 1 to 1.5 liters of content after a typical meal. Primarily, the stomach is a food storage organ. But it breaks up food particles and liquefies food and begins some of the chemical digestion for protein and fat. The soupy mixture that's formed in the stomach, made up of this liquefied food, is called chyme. Most of the digestion will actually occur after chyme passes from the stomach to the small intestine. It's got greater curvatures and lesser curvatures. The lesser curvature, the small one here on the superior border, and on the inferior border, the greater curvature. The stomach will have a nearly vertical orientation in tall people and pretty horizontal in smaller people. It's divided into 4 regions. First, the cardiac region, right here by the cardiac orifice where food enters the stomach. The fundic region is the portion superior to the esophageal attachment, so here. Then the body. This is the main portion of the stomach. The body right in here. The pyloric region, the stomach narrows slightly, so this is the pyloric region at the inferior end. It has sort of a funnel-like atrium right here. And there's a narrower pyloric canal. And the pylorus is the narrow passage we see moving on into the small intestine. The pylorus is guarded by the pyloric sphincter or the gastroduodenal sphincter, and it regulates the passage of chyme into the duodenum. The stomach receives nervous input from the vagus nerve, parasympathetic fibers, and also sympathetic input from the celiac ganglia. If you remember, each of the sympathetic groups had a ganglia close to the organ of interest. The blood supply comes from the celiac trunk, and then all blood that drains from the stomach and intestines is going to enter hepatic portal circulation. It's our second example of a portal system. The purpose of the hepatic portal circulation is to bring the blood drained from the stomach through the liver to be filtered before returning the blood to the heart. Here's a picture of a dissected stomach. Same thing, the fundic region up here, the cardiac orifice and the cardiac region. We can see the body, and we can see in this empty stomach even gastric rugae, these folds on the internal surface of the stomach. We get down into the pyloric region. The pyloric sphincter here is quite notable, the pyloric canal, and the atrium. Once we get into the microscopic anatomy, we'll see that the stomach is predominantly simple columnar epithelium. The apical regions of the surface cells are filled with mucin, which when in contact with water will swell and become mucus after it's secreted. The mucosa and submucosa are flat when the stomach is full. But remember the rugae you could see in the dissected stomach? Well, when the stomach's contracted and empty, these gastric rugae will arise. The muscularis externa of the stomach has 3 layers instead of 2. There's an outer longitudinal layer. There's a circular layer beneath that. And on the most inner surface, there's the oblique layer of muscle. There are gastric pits, which are little depressions all over the gastric mucosa. The gastric pits are lined with simple columnar epithelium, and they have 2 or 3 tubular glands that open into the bottom of each pit. Here's a picture of a gastric pit. You can see all of the tops of the simple columnar tissue here. And as you go down into the pit, we'll see that it terminates in some gastric glands. 2 to 3 of each of these will come into the bottom of each gastric pit. There are cardiac glands in the cardiac region. There are pyloric glands in the pyloric region and gastric glands throughout the rest of the stomach. This is a great figure showing the mucosa, which is a combination of the simple columnar epithelium, as well as the lamina propria. Anytime we consider a mucosa, it comes along with underlying tissue, which is the lamina propria. So here's a figure of pyloric and gastric glands. They're very similar, but have slightly different components. The cells of gastric glands, there are several different types of cells in gastric and pyloric glands. There's mucus cells, which secrete mucus, and these are predominant in the cardiac and pyloric glands. In gastric glands, we'll see mucus neck cells right here, since they're concentrated in the neck of the gland. We'll also see regenerative stem cells. They're found at the base of the pit and in the neck of the gland. And they can divide rapidly and produce a continual supply of new cells to replace the cells of the gastric glands or pyloric glands or cardiac glands that die. There are also parietal cells. Those are found mostly in the upper half of the gland. They secrete hydrochloric acid, so they are integral to the functioning of the stomach. They also secrete intrinsic factor and ghrelin, the hormone that's responsible for the sensation of hunger. There are chief cells. You can see here. The chief cells are the most numerous cells in any of these glands. They secrete lipase and pepsinogen. We'll find them mostly in the lower half of gastric glands, and we will not find them in either pyloric or cardiac glands. So no chief cells in pyloric and cardiac glands. Finally, we'll see enteroendocrine cells at the bottom side of the gland. They'll secrete a variety of different hormones and paracrine messengers that regulate digestion. We'll visit these later. These G cells are gastrin-secreting cells. We produce about 2 to 3 liters of gastric juice each day, which is mainly a mixture of water, hydrochloric acid, and pepsin. The gastric juice has a lot of hydrochloric acid in it and can produce a pH as low as 0.8, so less than 1. Very acidic. The parietal cells produce the hydrochloric acid. They contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and as you'll remember, carbonic anhydrase was integral in taking carbon dioxide, combining it with water, coming about with carbonic acid, and then bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen is then pumped into the gastric gland lumen over here by an enzyme hydrogen potassium ATPase. Functions in a very similar way to a sodium potassium pump. It's an antiporter, so it exchanges potassium for hydrogen. Now we have hydrogen out in the lumen of the gastric gland. Similar to blood buffering, we'll see the chloride exchange, where bicarbonate is exchanged for chloride. So chloride is brought into the cell, bicarbonate is put into the blood. We see that the chloride is then pumped into the lumen of the gastric gland also, where it will combine with the hydrogen that was pumped there to form hydrochloric acid. This makes the blood a little bit more basic as it's leaving the stomach. So blood leaving the stomach is said to have an alkaline tide because the pH is increased causing the blood to be a little more alkaline than usual. The following animation will show you how hydrochloric acid is secreted into the lumen of the gastric gland.
Hydrochloric acid is produced in parietal cells located in the gastric glands of the stomach lining through a complex series of reactions. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the parietal cell, and the enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyzes a reaction between the carbon dioxide and water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion, and the bicarbonate ion is transported back into the bloodstream. An ion exchange molecule in the plasma membrane exchanges bicarbonate going out for chloride coming in. The hydrogen ions are actively transported into the duct of the gastric gland, and the negatively charged chloride ions diffuse with the positively charged hydrogen ions. Potassium ions are countertransported into the parietal cell in exchange for hydrogen ions. The net result is production of hydrochloric acid in the parietal cells and its secretion into the duct of the gastric gland.
Now take a moment, pause this recording, and go ahead. Close your books, see what you can do to diagram the production of hydrochloric acid and secretion into the lumen of the gastric glands. Now let's look at the functions of hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is involved in activating the enzymes pepsin and lingual lipase. So we start to see digestion of fat from the lingual lipase and a little bit of protein by pepsin. It's also going to act to break up connective tissues and plant cell walls, which will help liquefy the food to form the chyme, so that when it enters the small intestine, things are in their smallest form and easier to digest. It converts ingested ferric ions, Fe3+, to ferrous, Fe2+, which is the form that can be absorbed, and it's necessary for the formation of hemoglobin. Also, this hydrochloric acid contributes to nonspecific disease resistance by destroying most ingested pathogens. As you know, the mucus that we have from our respiratory system, the majority of it ends up going into the stomach. Any pathogens that are contained in that mucus are neutralized here. So now we've completed the gastric secretion of hydrochloric acid. We'll take a section break here to separate the stomach into two parts. So this concludes part 1. You can now move on to part 2 of the stomach.